Hey, welcome to That Retro Life. I'm Andrew Horn. This is a show where we talk about that retro life that a lot of us are living and the things that made us who we are and our appreciation for the things that made us who we are. Now, what has occurred to me throughout the entirety of the first series and the first episode of the second series that I posted last week, I haven't actually talked about the book itself all that much. I've been giving book updates and whatnot, but I've never actually given you a sample of the book. So on this episode, I'm going to give you an exclusive first heard anywhere excerpts from the book, That Retro Life. It's the ongoing working draft, so it may change by the time it gets published, but remember, I am trying to get this book out there and get noticed for it. I do need a publisher and an agent for this one, so I don't want to put this one out under my own imprint like a lot of the other ones I've put out have been. But I thought this would be an interesting experiment to see how it reads out loud, and also it gives me an excuse to share a load of footage I had in the vault from lots of previous retro hunting adventures that have never been seen on this channel or in any episode of That Retro Life at all. So here it is, the first ever little snippet from my new book, That Retro Life. Nostalgia is a funny thing. Looking back at the endless battles between toys on my bedroom floor that filled years of my childhood, I remember adventure and excitement as Luke Skywalker and He-Man joined up with Optimus Prime and the heroic Autobots to battle the combined forces of Darth Vader, Skeletor, Megatron and the evil Decepticons. Mum-Ra tried to get in on the action as well, but Lion-O soon waved the Sword of Omens around and Mum-Ra did a runner. That's how imposing Lion-O could be when I'd found a battery for the power ring that made his eyes light up. In reality, those days that took years in my head only probably lasted a few months before I moved on to other toy lines based on weekly cartoons and deemed them the greatest things ever made. The above mentioned epic confrontation probably took place during 1986. I turned 8 that summer, so that gives you an idea of the impressionable age I was at. Once 1987 brought the real Ghostbusters to UK screens, the toy obsessions of previous years were packed away into my overflowing toy boxes in preparation for the arrival of Peter Venkman, Ray Stantz, Egon Spengler and Winston Zeddemore. I would always love those older toy lines, but I was a sucker for the next thing. That's what it was like being a kid in the 80s. Lots of people talk about the music or the films of the era, but for retro fans like myself, it's the physical items we had around ourselves that provided connection to those developmental years when middle age seemed like it was a million years away. Now, for me anyway, it's those young years that feel a million years away. That's probably at the root of my ongoing fascination with pop culture relics of the past. A few years ago, my then current obsession was collecting old VHS tapes of films I remember renting from Metro Video in Sheffield back in the days where you actually had to put the remote down and go somewhere to get a film you wanted to see. This obsession boiled over into blog posts, social media groups and eventually writing and self-publishing a book called VHS Ate My Brain in 2014. I thought nobody would read it. Littered with typos and hyperbole, it was far from perfect. I wrote the thing for myself as a bit of VHS merchandise more than anything else. It hadn't really occurred to me that anyone would buy it. It sold for years all over the world and became a minor cult hit. I still get enough royalties every 6 weeks or so from that book to buy lunch, so thanks VHS. To this day there is an active VHS scene around the world, with outlets such as Lunch Meat, the main dude of which, Josh Schaefer, did the artwork for the first edition of VHS Ate My Brain, offering clothing, zines and tapes to a ravenous fanbase. Documentaries like Rewind This, Video Nasty's The Definitive Guide and Adjust Your Tracking, in my opinion the best one, and not just because my name's in the credits as a Kickstarter backer, they are offering something new to a VHS hungry crowd. What that experience taught me was there were people like me all over the place with a love for old stuff that society had moved on from. Physical media, posters, soundtracks, toys, video games for long obsolete consoles, trading cards, weird bits of packaging, adverts from magazines, catalogues, that sort of thing. There's value in all of it. I discovered a vibrant and dedicated retro pop culture scene on YouTube with excellent content from the likes of Toy Galaxy, Pixel Dan, Retro Rick, Ed's Retro Geek Out, Laura Legends, Empire Toys 1138, Metal Jesus Rocks, The Gebs 24, to name just a few. There are thousands of videos of collectors hunting for retro pop culture treasures around the world, in charity shops, second-hand stores, at conventions, and even at private homes. While the channels are very different in approach and focus, the enthusiasm for nostalgia is the same. For me, loving retro pop culture collectibles and media isn't about completing a set or having the biggest collection. For me, it's all about appreciating the things that spoke to me as a kid and shaped my cultural development, the stuff I had fun with. These things act as an anchor between middle-aged me and the me that stared wide-eyed at every episode of Transformers and the real Ghostbusters, the me that wished he had a special helmet with powers like the guy in Mask, the me that wished he could yell "Power Extreme" and have armour beamed onto him like in Centurions. Oh, and especially the me that wanted to hang out in the Ghostbusters firehouse base with Slimer and Janine Melnitz. Actually, it's probably down to Janine Melnitz that I developed a thing for ladies in glasses, so thanks Janine, as I may not have got together with my wife if it hadn't been for you. But why did the pop culture icons of our childhoods in the 80s manage to endure so long, while the icons of previous generations didn't have the same staying power? They don't seem to anyway. I'd put that down to the pop culture icons of the 80s and early 90s being so deeply ingrained with their marketing that it was impossible for kids to not get swept up in the hype. Shows like Masters of the Universe and Transformers were pretty much completely intended as lengthy toy ads. See the episode, enjoy the adventure, buy the characters you just watched, rinse and repeat, until your parents are bankrupted by Castle Grayskull, endless action figures, bedding, t-shirts, lunchboxes and more. Don't forget to keep up with the time books, comics, games as well, kids. In that respect, the era that brought these properties into the mass consciousness were quite cynical. However, the creators involved did a fantastic job ensuring the characters and stories were compelling and entertaining enough to maintain kids' attention. They certainly maintained mine. It's strange to think that the things I love and the time that made me get further away with each day. An era that I lived through that has been captured as some kind of time capsule in my mind and the hobby that I've delved into, but it only becomes more distant. Back when I was in the middle of it all, it was impossible to think of things being any other way. We didn't have the frame of reference that the passing of time offers. When I had drawers of cassettes, a bookcase of VHS tapes, the early stages of my comic library and much more hair, it seemed that the world had reached its cultural zenith and wouldn't change until some vague point in the future when all of a sudden we'd all have psychic robots, cryostasis pods instead of beds, and be driven around by Johnny Cab, like in Total Recall. It felt immovable, vague and distant. But then time did that thing that time does and moves on. Before I knew it, time was moving at an ever-increasing velocity away from what was familiar. Kids' TV became alien. Fashions changed quickly, usually as I was just getting used to the previous one. What was in wasn't in anymore. Acne came in waves, chest hair flourished, the hair on my head retreated. Suddenly the 15-year-old kid sat playing Streets of Rage 2 on a Sega Mega Drive in his poster-cake bedroom had become a man in his 40s, dealing with fatherhood, day jobs, and the inescapable notion that he wasn't young anymore. One day had arrived, and it was way more stressful and confusing than my teenage daydreams had let on, the buggers. I look back now and it's odd thinking of all the things that I loved dearly that came to an end years ago. TV shows like Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Xena Warrior Princess and Babylon 5 have all long since had their day and faded into the mists of the past. Comics and bands and radio shows and magazines and so many other aspects of the cultural zeitgeist of my youth are just relics now. Does my fascination with elements of pop culture's past mean I dislike the present? In some ways that's probably right. As with the social, financial and political issues that have dogged us here and now, coupled with the obvious apocalyptic global pandemic, I can't help but miss a more simple life. Was it that simple though? Was a world of TFI Friday, Melody Maker, the Sci-Fi Channel, not sci-fi, and free gifts in cereal boxes really easier than a world full of things like TikTok, Spotify and Huel? No, of course it wasn't. At the time, the older generation was waxing lyrical about the 60s and 70s, particularly the 60s. It was the blueprint for what people like me are going through right now. We think of our past as a simple time where everything made sense. But the past we remember was just as complicated. It had a plethora of issues, but we didn't have to deal with those issues. It was our parents, it was the adults, the people we thought of as boring, that we thought of as quaint for their obsession with coupons, that we thought of as out of touch. They were out of touch because they were trying to make ends meet through the latest financial crisis or thing that needed to be taken care of at home. They listened to old songs and watched old TV programs because they were familiar. They were soothing. They were relics of their past with the rough edges smoothed off, anchors to an earlier self. And that's what I find myself doing now. And you know what? I'm glad I'm not alone in it. So there you have it, the first ever exclusive snippet from my new book, That Retro Life. It is from the working draft, as I say, so it is subject to change as we go forward, but I wanted to get something out there that gave you an example of what I have been doing with this, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you want to see more of the episodes of That Retro Life, and indeed my regular Planet Hex shows, where I'm talking about VHS and pop culture and all kinds of other things, please do like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it if you did. It's always lovely to have new people on board, and you are all very, very welcome. I really do appreciate it. It's really good fun putting this stuff together and writing this book, and I'm really enjoying being part of the retro community that has it's meant a lot to me over the last few years, and I'm glad to see it thriving in many ways. So thank you ever so much for watching this episode of That Retro Life.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and validate my existence.